Episode 5 of Lost Flight MH370, we are going to look into the possibility that a loss of cabin pressure led to a cascading series of events that doomed the flight. We will examine the circumstances surrounding two incidents in which aircraft were lost due to failed pressurization of the aircraft cabin. These two instances will give us some insight into the insidious nature of a depressurization event unfolding aboard an aircraft. The two incidents we will be looking into are Helios Flight 522 and the Payne Stewart Learjet 35 accident. The Helios Flight 522 incident occurred on August 14, 2005 as the aircraft was bound from Larnaca, Cyprus to Athens, Greece. The Payne Stewart Learjet incident occurred on October 25, 1999 as the aircraft was on an intended course from Orlando, Florida to Dallas, Texas. These two incidents will give us a basis for extrapolating what may have happened aboard Flight MH370 on March 8, 2014. Before we get into our examination of these two incidents, we want to look at exactly why aircraft cabins are pressurized and how a lack of pressurization at altitude affects the human body. As we begin our look at pressurization in the human body, let me start with some basics. We live on planet Earth at the bottom of a vast ocean of gases that make up our atmosphere, which is composed largely of nitrogen at 78% and oxygen at 21%. This ocean extends at the extremes as far as 6,200 miles out into space, where it merges with the solar wind. For the purposes of commercial aviation, an altitude of about 42,000 feet is the maximum height flown. Each model of commercial aircraft has its own altitude range of optimal operation, with the sweet spot being around 35,000 feet. In order for humans to survive at an altitude of 35,000 feet, the aircraft cabin must be pressurized. Humans living at sea level experience an atmospheric pressure of about 14.7 pounds per square inch or 14.7 psi. If you lived in Lhasa, Tibet, where the elevation is 11,800 feet, you would experience a psi of 9.42. At the highest point humans can reach on Earth, Mount Everest, at an elevation of 29,029 feet, the psi is a meager 4.56. At 35,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure drops to about 3.47 psi. Aircraft cabins in general are pressurized to a cabin altitude of between 6,000 and 8,000 feet, which corresponds to a psi of 11.78 to 10.91. This 6,000 to 8,000 foot range is a compromise that allows for passenger comfort while making it financially feasible to build and operate profitable aircraft. An aircraft designed and built to pressurize its cabin to 14.7 psi under current design constraints would be commercially unviable. Above an altitude of about 8,000 feet, the oxygen saturation of hemoglobin in human red blood cells begins to decrease rapidly. This is due to the fact that as atmospheric pressure drops due to altitude, the atmosphere becomes less dense, thus less oxygen molecules available to sustain an adequate oxygen saturation level. With this decrease in oxygen saturation, the body loses its ability to maintain metabolic functions necessary for survival. A condition known as hypoxia sets in, hypoxia being a lack of oxygen in the body tissues. The effects of hypoxia can manifest themselves in fatigue, confusion, euphoria, inability to concentrate, impaired decision-making, and eventually loss of consciousness and death. Studies have shown that as hypoxia sets in, there is a span of time termed time of useful consciousness, or TUC. This is simply a general estimate of the time available to the average human in which the thought processes remain sufficiently lucid to make good decisions. This period will vary from person to person based on physical fitness and adaptation to higher altitudes. As we can see in our diagram here, at 20,000 feet, with the loss of cabin pressurization and an atmospheric pressure of 6.76 psi, hypoxia sets in, giving about 20 minutes of TUC. At an altitude of 35,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure has fallen to 3.47 psi, and TUC is estimated at 30 to 60 seconds. The onset of hypoxia is insidious. In most instances, the persons involved in a slow depressurization event may not even realize what is happening. In military aviation, the pilots are given hypoxia training to recognize the onset of hypoxia. In one study, only 3.8% of military aircrews that had undergone hypoxia training experienced a loss of consciousness. The same study showed that 94% of airline passengers lost consciousness with the onset of a depressurization event leading to hypoxia. With this knowledge in hand, let's begin our look at our two aircraft depressurization events, starting with the Payne Stewart Learjet incident of October 25, 1999. On October 25, 1999, at 9:19 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, a Learjet 35 under the registration N47BA departs Orlando International Airport on an intended course to Love Field in Dallas, Texas. The Learjet is a chartered aircraft operated by Sunjet Aviation out of Stanford, Florida. The pilot in charge is 42-year-old Michael Kling. The first officer is 27-year-old Stephanie Bellagarig. The four passengers are professional golfer Payne Stewart, his two business agents Van Arden and Robert Fraley, and golf course designer Bruce Borland. At 9:21 a.m., air traffic control instructs N47BA to climb to and maintain flight level 260 or 26,000 feet. At 9:23 a.m., air traffic control clears the flight for a direct course to Cross City, Florida, then straight on to Dallas, Texas. At 9:26 a.m., the Learjet is issued instructions by Jacksonville ATC to change radio frequency and contact another air traffic controller. First Officer Bellagarig acknowledges the frequency change. At 9:27 a.m., air traffic control instructs N47BA to climb to flight level 390 or 39,000 feet. The first officer acknowledges the ATC instructions with 390 Bravo Alpha. This is the last known transmission from the flight crew of the Learjet. At 9:33 a.m., approximately 6 minutes after the last contact, air traffic control instructs N47BA to change radio frequency and contact a different ATC controller. There is no response from N47BA. The air traffic controller attempts to contact the flight crew 5 times over the next 4.5 minutes, but receives no response from the aircraft. At about 9:52 a.m. Central Daylight Time, a United States Air Force F-16 out of Eglin Air Force Base in Florida is performing flight exercises near Pensacola, Florida. At the request of the FAA, the F-16 pilot is tasked with intercepting and reporting back on the status of the non-responsive Learjet. By 9:54 a.m. Central Daylight Time, the F-16 piloted by Chris Hamilton intercepts N47BA over Tennessee at an altitude of 46,400 feet. Hamilton radios the wayward Learjet twice but receives no response. His visual inspection of the aircraft shows no damage. Both engines are running and the rotating beacon is functioning. He reports that the passenger windows are dark and the cockpit windshield appears opaque, as if from condensation or being iced over. At 10:12 a.m., Hamilton concludes his inspection of the Learjet and proceeds to Scott Air Force Base in Illinois. At 11:13 a.m. Central Daylight Time, 2 Oklahoma Air National Guard F-16s with the identification Tulsa 13 are vectored to intercept and report on N-47BA. About 11:25 a.m., the lead pilot of Tulsa 13 reports that the Learjet cockpit windshield is dark, but he cannot tell if it is iced over. At 11:33 a.m., the pilots of Tulsa 13 report that the Learjet is not reacting or making any flight control responses to the escorting F-16s. At 11:39 a.m., the Tulsa 13 F-16s take leave of the Learjet and rendezvous with an airborne tanker for refueling. About 11:50 a.m. Central Daylight Time, 2 North Dakota Air National Guard F-16s with the identification NODAC 32 are vectored to intercept N-47BA. The 2 F-16s of Tulsa 13, having completed refueling, return to the pursuit. As the chase of the ghost plane continues high in the skies above the Midwest, national news outlets begin picking up the story. Americans flock to their TVs for news of the unfolding tragedy. At 12:10 p.m., from the Learjet's recovered cockpit voice recorder is heard the sounds of an engine winding down and the autopilot disconnect alert. The cockpit voice recorder also captures the continuous sound of the cabin altitude all warning alert. At 12:11 p.m., the lead pilot of NODAC 32 reports the target is descending and he is doing multiple aileron rolls. Looks like he is out of control and a severe descent. Request an emergency descent to follow the target. One of the pilots of Tulsa 13 reports it's soon to impact the ground. He is in a descending spiral. At about 12:13 p.m., the Learjet impacts the ground at near supersonic speed on the farmland of John Hoffman, just outside the community of Mina, South Dakota. The aircraft is completely destroyed. The NTSB's final conclusion on the loss of the flight was, the probable cause of this accident was incapacitation of the flight crew members as a result of their failure to receive supplemental oxygen following a loss of cabin pressurization for undetermined reasons. Over the prior several months, going back to July of 1999, there had been documented maintenance issues with N-47BA regarding the ability of the aircraft to maintain proper cabin pressurization. The NTSB noted that inadequate record-keeping by Sunjet Aviation maintenance personnel made it difficult to determine whether the prior cabin pressurization issues had any connection with the loss of the flight. The critical period in the flight of N-47BA is the approximate 6-minute time span from 9:27 a.m. to 9:33 a.m., the period from the first officer's last radio contact to the failed attempt by the air traffic controller to contact the flight. During this time span, the aircraft is climbing to 39,000 feet. It is during this 6-minute time span that the flight crew and passengers lose consciousness, some 14 minutes into the flight. Exactly what led to the loss of cabin pressure aboard the flight is unknown. There was some speculation that the depressurization could have been caused by loss of bleed air inflow due to either a malfunction of the flow control valve or inappropriate flight crew action. Bleed air is compressed air taken from the compressor stage of a jet engine used to pressurize and heat an aircraft cabin via the aircraft's air conditioning system. A compromised bleed air system can lead to cabin pressurization issues. Whatever the cause of the depressurization event, the outcome was the onset of hypoxia, resulting in the loss of consciousness of the flight crew and passengers. Those aboard N-47BA were most likely dead long before the aircraft impacted the field in South Dakota. Let's now turn to Helios Flight 522, an aircraft incident with eerie similarities echoing the loss of Flight MH370. We will now begin our look at the Helios 522 incident of August 14, 2005. The tragic tale of Helios 522 actually begins with the prior flight of the aircraft on August 13, 2005, as it flew from London Heathrow in the United Kingdom to Larnaca, Cyprus. On the flight from London to Larnaca, the cabin crew noted a problem with the aft service door. This was passed on to the flight crew, who recorded the concern in the aircraft technical log, noting aft service door requires full inspection. When Helios 522 landed at Larnaca at 1:25 a.m. local time, the ground engineer on duty performed the required inspection of the Boeing 737. He visually inspected the aft service door and carried out a cabin pressurization leak check. While doing the check, he set the cabin pressurization panel mode selector to manual. He noted in his report that he found no leaks or abnormal noises associated with the aft service door. The aircraft was released for the next flight at 3:15 a.m. local time, with the pressurization panel mode selector still set to manual. At 6:07 a.m. local time, Helios 522 took off from the Larnaca airport bound for Prague, Czech Republic via Athens, Greece. At 6:11 a.m., the flight crew of Helios 522 contacted the Nicosia Area Control Center as they climbed through flight level 100 toward flight level 200, or 20,000 feet. At this time, the captain requested a final cruising level of 340, or 34,000 feet. This was the last recorded contact between the flight crew of Helios 522 and the Nicosia Area Control Center. At 6:12 a.m., at an altitude of 12,040 feet, the cabin altitude warning alert began to sound aboard Helios 522. At 6:14 a.m., the captain contacted the Helios Operations Center, reporting a takeoff configuration warning on. The dispatcher at the Helios Operations Center requested an on-duty company ground engineer to communicate with the captain. A conversation ensued between the captain and the ground engineer concerning the state of the equipment cooling system. The captain was complaining that the ventilation cooling fan lights are off. The captain then asked, "Where are the cooling fan circuit breakers?" The engineer replied, "Behind the captain's seat." The conversation with the captain became more puzzling to the ground engineer as it continued. The engineer was beginning to think there was some confusion on the part of the captain as to what control panel was being discussed. Since the ground engineer had used the pressurization control panel prior to the flight, he asked the captain to confirm that the pressurization panel selector mode was set to auto. The captain's replies seemed unfocused and nonsensical to the ground engineer. At 6:14 a.m., the passenger oxygen mask deployed as the cabin altitude, the interior pressurization of the aircraft cabin, exceeded 14,000 feet, some 6,000 to 8,000 feet beyond normal. At 6:20 a.m., the communications between the ground engineer and the captain ended as the aircraft was passing through 28,900 feet. Shortly afterwards, the Helios operations dispatcher called the flight crew of Helios 522, but there was no answer. At 6:23 a.m., Helios Flight 522 leveled off at 34,000 feet under control of its autopilot. At 6:29 a.m., the Helios operations dispatcher called Nicosia ACC and requested the air traffic controller contact Helios 522. Between 6:30 to 6:35 a.m., Nicosia ACC attempted to contact the flight numerous times but received no response. At 6:36 a.m., Nicosia ACC contacted the ATC controller at Athena ACC, informing them that Helios 522 was entering the Athena flight information region. The Nicosia ACC controller noted that Helios 522 was not answering any attempts at radio communication. At 6:37 a.m., Helios 522 entered the Athena flight information region at flight level 340 along its planned flight route to Athens, Greece. At 6:40 a.m., Nicosia ACC contacted Athena ACC, asking if there had been any contact with Helios 522. Athena ACC replied, "Not yet." At 7:12 a.m., Athena ACC radar control called Helios 522 to issue a descent clearance into the Athens airport. There was no response from Helios 522. Between 7:13 to 7:14 a.m., Athena ACC attempted to contact Helios 522 11 times, but received no response from the aircraft. At 7:16 a.m., the Athena ACC supervisor, after being informed of the non-responsive flight, notified Athena Approach Control, Athens Tower, and the Hellenic Air Force. At 7:29 a.m., Helios Flight 522 passed over the Athens airport at flight level 340. At 7:37 a.m., the non-responsive aircraft reached the key of VOR and entered a holding pattern. At 7:53 a.m., the Athena ACC declared an alert phase to the Joint Rescue Coordination Center. At 8:23 a.m., during the 6th holding pattern circuit, Helios 522 was intercepted by two F-16s from the Hellenic Air Force. The F-16s attempted to communicate with and signal the aircraft, but received no response. At 8:32 a.m., one of the F-16 pilots reported that the captain's seat in the cockpit was vacant. He further noted that there was a figure slumped over the controls in the first officer's seat. He also noted that he could see several passengers wearing oxygen masks sitting motionless in their seats. At 8:34 a.m., Athena ACC declared a distress phase to the Joint Rescue Coordination Center. At 8:49 a.m., during the 10th and last holding pattern circuit, one of the F-16 pilots observed a person entering the cockpit and sitting down in the captain's seat. The person was bending over the flight controls. In this same 8:49 a.m. time frame, the aircraft's left engine flamed out. The aircraft turned steeply and headed in a northerly direction. Due to the erratic maneuvering of the Boeing 737, the F-16s followed at a distance. When the F-16s were next able to approach the Boeing 737, they noted that the person in the captain's seat appeared to acknowledge the fighter jets for the first time with a hand motion. The F-16 pilots hand-signaled the person to follow them. The lone figure's only response was to point downwards. At 8:59 a.m., as the plane continued to descend, the right engine flamed out at about 7,000 feet. At 9:03 a.m., the aircraft impacted the ground in hilly terrain near the Greek village of Grammatico with 121 souls aboard. In the Hellenic Republic accident investigation, the cause of the accident centered on improper pressurization of the aircraft cabin. The investigators focused on the aircraft's cabin pressurization panel, which had been found among the wreckage with the mode selector switch in the manual position. When the ground engineer had performed his leak check back early on the morning prior to the takeoff of Helios 522 on its journey to Athens, he had set the mode selector switch to manual. It was then the responsibility of the two pilots to properly configure Helios 522 for takeoff that morning. The pilots had two opportunities to see that the pressurization mode selector switch was set to auto. The first opportunity was during the pre-flight configuration. The second opportunity was when performing the after takeoff checklist. With the cabin pressurization mode selector in the manual position, the aircraft cabin was not being automatically pressurized as it climbed towards its cruising altitude of 34,000 feet. As the aircraft gained altitude and lost cabin pressurization, the pilots became unfocused and confused as they entered a hypoxic state. With the pulse of the warning alerts throbbing through the cockpit and mounting stress, the hypoxic pilots were quickly losing their ability to reason properly. In a short time, the pilots were unconscious and the aircraft proceeded on via autopilot. The oxygen masks had deployed in the passenger cabin, and some of the passengers had donned their masks as noted by the F-16 pilots. The passenger masks, however, have an oxygen supply that lasts approximately 12 minutes, no solution to a long-term hypoxic event. The only observed conscious person aboard Helios 522 was flight attendant Andreas Prodromou. He was the lone figure the F-16 pilot saw in the aircraft's cockpit prior to the crash. He had remained conscious till the end by making use of the emergency oxygen bottles aboard the aircraft. His last feeble mayday calls were captured by the aircraft's cockpit voice recorder as the plane neared the end of its flight. The final accident report noted that the autopsies on the bodies recovered from the crash site of Helios 522 revealed that the cabin's occupants had heart function during the impact. It was hypothesized that the victims were in deep non-reversible comas at the time of the crash, not yet dead, but somewhere beyond life. Let's now take the information presented in our two aircraft incidents and see if it can help illuminate the events surrounding the loss of flight MH370. We will now begin our summarization and analysis of the two aircraft incidents we have just examined. Our goal is to glean what we can from these two incidents and compare them to the events surrounding the loss of flight MH370. Is it possible that MH370 also suffered a pressurization event that led to its disappearance? This is the question we will attempt to answer. Let's analyze and compare the early stages of each flight, the Learjet 35 incident, the Helios 522 incident, and the flight of MH370. In the case of the Payne Stewart incident and the Helios 522 incident, near the 14-minute mark after takeoff, the flights were essentially doomed. With the Learjet N47BA incident, the aircraft takes off at 9:19 local time and begins climbing to an altitude of 39,000 feet. By 9:27, we have the last contact between ATC and N47BA. By 9:33, ATC is unable to contact N47BA. No further contact is established with the flight. Approximately 14 minutes into the flight, the occupants of the plane have been overcome by hypoxia and lose consciousness. N47BA flies on via autopilot under the last entered heading and crashes some 3 hours and 54 minutes after takeoff after exhausting its fuel supply. Whether the aircraft suffered some mechanical issue or a failure of the pilots to see that the cabin was pressurized, the outcome was the loss of the flight. With Helios 522, we see a similar outcome to the flight. In the case of Helios 522, the full flight route had been preloaded into the autopilot, thus it flew on along its planned route until it ran out of fuel. Helios 522 takes off at 6:07 a.m. local time and begins its climb to an altitude of 34,000 feet. At 6:12, 5 minutes into the flight, the cabin altitude warning begins to sound in the aircraft cockpit. At 6:14, the captain contacts the Helios Operations Center to complain of a takeoff configuration warning. In this same time frame, the passenger oxygen masks deploy in the aircraft cabin. At 6:20, contact between the captain and the Helios Operations Center ends. The Helios Operations Center is unable to re-establish contact with Helios Flight 522. Approximately 14 minutes into the flight, the pilots have been overcome by hypoxia and lost consciousness. Some of the passengers aboard Helios 522 had donned oxygen masks. They would have remained conscious for roughly 12 minutes beyond the initial deployment of the masks. We also have the somewhat puzzling circumstances surrounding flight attendant Andreas Prodromou, who managed to survive till the end of the flight using portable emergency oxygen bottles. Prodromou, who did hold a UK commercial pilot license, though not qualified on a Boeing 737, was able to gain entry to the cockpit during the last minutes of the flight using an emergency access code. The circumstances of Prodromou's entry into the cockpit are based on information gleaned from the aircraft's recovered cockpit voice recorder. Due to the limitations of the CVR, which only retained information for the last 30 minutes of the flight, it is unknown if Prodromou was able to enter the cockpit earlier. Ultimately, Helios 522 was lost due to the failure of the pilots to properly configure the aircraft for flight, namely an oversight in not checking the pressurization control panel to confirm it was set to auto. Let's now compare our two previous incidents with the loss of flight MH370. Flight MH370 took off from the Kuala Lumpur airport at 12:42 a.m. Malaysia time. By 1:01 Malaysia time, MH370 had reached flight level 350. At 1:19, we have the last contact between the Kuala Lumpur ATC and flight MH370, some 37 minutes into the flight. At 1:21, MH370's transponder goes offline and the aircraft leaves its planned flight route. MH370 turns back southwesterly and begins a long, secretive flight path that takes it deep into the southern Indian Ocean. Between MH370's sign-off to the Kuala Lumpur ATC and the loss of the transponder signal, we have about 1 minute and 47 seconds of elapsed time. At the sign-off by Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah at 37 minutes into the flight, there is no indication of a problem with the aircraft. At this time, the aircraft was flying at 35,000 feet. If there was some sudden depressurization of the aircraft cabin, right after the sign-off to Kuala Lumpur ATC by Captain Shaw, the cabin altitude warning alert would have sounded in the cockpit. The proper procedure would have been for the pilots of MH370 to don oxygen masks. They would have immediately initiated a descent to 10,000 feet, declaring an emergency situation to either Kuala Lumpur or Ho Chi Minh Air Traffic Control. If for some reason the pilots of MH370 were quickly overcome by hypoxia and unable to react, the aircraft would have then proceeded along its planned flight route via autopilot, just as did Helios 522. MH370 would have become a ghost plane bound for Beijing, China. This isn't what happened. At 39 minutes into the flight, the transponder goes offline, most likely turned off by some entity aboard MH370 by switching the transponder control panel to standby. MH370 is diverted from its planned flight route to a route that takes it deep into the southern Indian Ocean. We see no indication that flight MH370 suffered an accidental depressurization event. The events that followed the loss of the transponder signal are atypical to any accident scenario. They appear to have a focused design and purpose. MH370's transponder goes offline just as it is transiting from the Kuala Lumpur Flight Information Region to the Ho Chi Minh Flight Information Region. The flight just happens to take place in the middle of the night when the aircraft is least likely to draw attention. The altered flight path appears designed to hide the aircraft from discovery, also aided by the darkness of night. The aircraft's SDU, which had gone offline for a time, is repowered once the plane has exited the reach of Malaysian military radar by someone aboard the aircraft. All these events point to a carefully planned diversion of MH370. But we do have one interesting clue that may hint at what was happening aboard flight MH370 as it was being diverted from its planned flight route. When Ho Chi Minh ATC was unable to raise MH370 on the radio, it requested a nearby aircraft to attempt to contact MH370. This aircraft was a Boeing 777 in Vietnamese airspace near the assumed location of MH370. The Boeing 777 was en route to Narita, Japan. The pilot of the Japanese-bound Boeing 777 reported that he made contact with MH370 about 1:30 a.m. Malaysia time using the International Air Distress Frequency. This would have been about 9 minutes after MH370's transponder went offline. The pilot of the Japanese-bound Boeing 777 reported, "There were a lot of interference, static, but I heard mumbling from the other end." The pilot further noted that he thought the voice he heard on the radio was that of MH370's co-pilot, Farik Abdul Hamid. Is it possible that whatever entity was acting aboard MH370 to commandeer the aircraft had weaponized the aircraft's pressurization system to subdue the crew and passengers? Was the mumbling the Japanese-bound pilot heard an attempt to communicate by First Officer Hamid, who was then falling into a hypoxic state? Through these last 4 episodes of Lost Flight MH370, we have concentrated on the possibility that the flight was lost due to an onboard accident or mechanical failure. In Episode 6 of Lost Flight MH370, we will begin our investigation into the possibility that human intervention was the reason for the loss of the flight and all aboard.